Hooters survived 40 years of economic downturns, cultural shifts, and waves of outrage. The brand seemed untouchable. Then in 2024, they filed for Chapter 11 and closed over 430 restaurants in less than 12 months. Not struggling, not restructuring, closing, padlock, turning off the lights permanently. The reason wasn't inflation. It wasn't the economy. It wasn't even the cultural reckoning that was already coming for them. It was one decision, one catastrophically avoidable financial decision made years earlier that turned a manageable problem into an unsurvivable. So how do you kill 430 locations in under a year? Let's walk through it. Hooters didn't start with a corporate vision or a private equity playbook. It started with 6 guys, a failing restaurant space in downtown Clearwater, Florida, and absolutely no idea what they were doing. October 4th, 1983. 6 co-founders, Ed Droste, Dennis Johnson, William Ranieri, Gil DiGianantonio, Don Jodier, and Lynn Stewart opened the first Hooters location on South Cleveland Street in Clearwater. None of them had significant restaurant experience. They scraped together the capital, signed a lease on a space that had housed a series of failed businesses, and opened a bar. The concept was not sophisticated. Cold beer, simple food, wings, burgers, fried shrimp, a beach bar atmosphere, transplanted inland, and waitresses in white tank tops and orange shorts. They called them Hooters Girls. The name was a double entendre they acknowledged with a wink. The logo was an owl, and the chain maintained forever after that. Hooters referred to owls. Nobody believed them. Everyone came anyway. And the first location shouldn't have worked. The space was difficult. The concept was unrefined. The founders were improvising in real time. But it worked. Immediately and undeniably it worked. Lines out the door, standing room only, the combination of casual atmosphere, affordable food, and the deliberate spectacle of the Hooters Girls concept proved to be a formula that resonated in a very specific way with a very specific customer, the American male, aged 21 to 55, looking for a place that felt like a sports bar, but with a brand identity. By 1984, they had sold their first franchise. By 1986, there were multiple locations across Florida. By the early 1990s, Hooters had gone national. By the mid-1990s, it had gone international. At its peak in the early 2000s, Hooters operated over 450 locations across the United States and was generating well over $1 billion in annual system-wide sales. It had become a legitimate American institution, present at airports, in suburbs, in tourist districts, in cities across 44 states. The kind of brand that needed no explanation. The kind of place you could mention to anyone in the country and they would know exactly what it was. That brand recognition was the asset. The food was secondary. The experience was the product. Now let's understand what Hooters actually was as a business, because this matters enormously for understanding how it died. Hooters operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. Corporate-owned locations, restaurants the company itself owned and operated, and franchise locations, restaurants owned by independent operators who paid Hooters licensing fees, royalties on sales, and followed brand standards in exchange for the right to use the name. The franchise model is the standard playbook for scaling a restaurant chain. McDonald's, Subway, Chick-fil-A, the biggest names in food service all rely heavily on franchising because it allows rapid expansion without the capital burden of owning every location. The franchisor collects fees and royalties without carrying the operating risk. The franchisee takes the risk in exchange for the established brand and customer base. At its mid-2000s peak, Hooters had a healthy mix of corporate and franchise locations. The system worked. Cash flow was stable. The brand was strong enough that franchise operators were willing to pay meaningful fees to use it. Then, private equity arrived. In 2011, a private equity group led by affiliates of Chanticleer Holdings and other investors acquired a controlling stake in Hooters of America. The specifics of the deal structure varied across different ownership tranches, but the effect was consistent with what private equity does to legacy consumer brands across almost every industry it touches. Load it with debt, extract value, optimize for short-term returns. Leave the long-term health of the business to whoever buys it next. Leveraged buyout. That's the technical term. It means using borrowed money, debt, to finance the acquisition. Then, using the acquired company's own cash flows to service that debt. The company becomes collateral for its own purchase. It's a financial structure that works when business conditions are stable and cash flows are predictable. It becomes catastrophic when those conditions change. Hooters entered the 2000s carrying a debt load it had not chosen and could not easily reduce. Every dollar of operating profit that could have been reinvested in modernizing restaurants, improving the menu, upgrading technology, training staff, or adapting to changing consumer taste was instead going to service debt that existed because someone had used the company as collateral to buy the company. This is the first layer of the trap, not visible yet, not causing immediate acute pain, but present and compound. Every year that passes without reinvestment is a year the competition pulls further ahead. Every year of debt service is a year of deferred maintenance, deferred menu innovation, deferred digital investment. Hooters in 2015 looked like Hooters in 2005 because it couldn't afford to look like anything else. And the customer who was 35 in 2005 was 45 in 2015, and his preferences had shifted. And new competitors had arrived who understood those shifted preferences better than a chain that hadn't meaningfully meaningfully evolved its concept in a decade. Let's talk about what was happening in the American restaurant market during the years Hooters was trapped in amber. The fast casual revolution, the Chipotle model, applied to every conceivable cuisine, was redefining what affordable dining looked like. Customers who might have gone to Hooters for wings were now going to Wingstop, which opened a new location seemingly every week throughout the 2000s. Wingstop offered a focused, wing-specific menu with aggressive flavor options, a modern ordering experience, and no ambient discomfort about whether the atmosphere was appropriate. Buffalo Wild Wings, which had launched in 1982, almost simultaneously with Hooters, had spent the 2000s aggressively modernized. Massive television installations for sports, a beer selection that kept pace with the craft beer revolution, updated interiors, a rewards program, digital order. B-Dubs, as its regulars called it, had figured out how to be a sports bar that served wings without carrying any of the cultural baggage Hooters carried. And it was winning the customer who had aged out of finding Hooters exciting and into wanting a place that just showed him the game. Wingstop, Buffalo Wild Wings, Dave's Hot Chicken, Raising Cane's, Zaxby's, the wing and casual dining competitive set that Hooters operated in had become genuinely ferocious. Every competitor was investing. Every competitor was modernizing. Every competitor was running loyalty programs and mobile ordering and delivery integrations. Hooters was not, because Hooters was servicing debt. The cultural headwinds were building simultaneously, and unlike the financial pressure, which was invisible to consumers, the cultural problem was very visible. The hashtag #MeToo move arrived in 2017 and fundamentally reordered the cultural conversation around workplace environments that objectified women. Hooters, a chain whose entire brand identity was built on the visual presentation of its female staff, was suddenly not just controversial in the way it had always been controversial, but actively uncomfortable for large segments of the population who had previously given it a pass. Women who might have gone with their partners stopped going. Corporate accounts, companies that had used Hooters for client entertainment or team events in the way that previous generations considered normal, quietly stopped booking. The brand that had survived 40 years of feminist criticism by operating just below the threshold of cultural unacceptability suddenly found the threshold had moved. The Hooters' response to this cultural shift was to introduce Hoots, a spin-off concept that stripped the brand down to chicken wings and a sports bar format without the Hooters girl aesthetic. It was an acknowledgement that the core brand had a problem, and it was too little, too late, and undercapitalized to compete with the chains that had built the sports bar without baggage format years earlier. The cultural problem didn't kill Hooters. The debt would do that, but the cultural problem accelerated the revenue decline that made the debt unserviceable. Now let's get to the decision, the one stupid, catastrophic, fully avoidable decision that turned a struggling brand into a bankruptcy filing. In 2023, Hooters of America's management team, operating under the shadow of years of debt service and declining same-store sales, made a lease renegotiation strategy decision that would prove fatal. Here's the context. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, the restaurant industry faced an existential shock. Indoor dining was banned across much of the country. Revenue collapsed overnight. Hooters, like virtually every restaurant chain, entered emergency negotiations with its landlord. Rent deferrals, lease modifications, forbearance agreements that allowed operators to survive the lockdown period by pushing obligations forward. Many of these agreements came with conditions, and one of those conditions in many of Hooters' lease structures was a personal guarantee backstop, meaning that if the corporate entity defaulted on the lease, one individual guarantors, executives, ownership entities could be held personally liable for the remaining lease obligation. In 2023, as the deferred obligations began to mature and the renegotiated lease terms came up for renewal, Hooters management made their play. Rather than renegotiating leases individually, addressing problem locations one by one, or working with landlords on a location-by-location basis, they attempted a mass restructuring of their lease portfolio. They wanted across-the-board rent reduction, simultaneously, from hundreds of landlords at once. The logic was understandable. If you're going to restructure your cost base, you restructure all of it together. One negotiation framework. Clean, efficient. The execution was a disaster. And landlords who might have been willing to negotiate individually, who had relationships with local franchise operators, who understood the specific economics of their specific property, were instead receiving blanket demands as part of a corporate-level campaign. And landlords talk to each other, especially commercial real estate landlords in the same markets, managed by the same REITs, advised by the same lawyers. When it became clear that Hooters was attempting a mass lease restructuring, which is the financial equivalent of telling all of your creditors simultaneously that you cannot pay your obligations as currently structured, it triggered something far worse than individual lease disputes. It triggered a confidence crisis. Lenders who were watching the lease renegotiation talks began reassessing their own exposure. Suppliers who were tracking the news began tightening credit terms. Franchise operators who had been quietly managing declining sales began to openly question whether the brand had a future worth investing in. The mass restructuring attempt, intended to solve the cost problem, instead announced the depth of the crisis to everyone with a financial relationship with the company, and it accelerated exactly the outcome it was designed to prevent. May 1st, 2024, Hooters of America America LLC filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Texas. Chapter 11, that's reorganization bankruptcy, not liquidation. The company is not immediately dissolved. It continues operating while it develops a plan to restructure its debts, renegotiate its obligations, and emerge as a viable going concern. At least that's what Chapter 11 is supposed to accomplish when it works. The filing listed assets of between $100 million and $500 million, liabilities of between $500 million and $1 billion. The gap between those numbers, that's the definition of insolvency. More owed than owned, but the bankruptcy filing wasn't the catastrophe. Chapter 11 is survivable. Plenty of restaurant chains have filed for Chapter 11 and emerged. Sparrow, Friendly's, Ruby Tuesday. The filing is a tool, a legal mechanism for buying time and forcing creditors to the table. What happened next was the catastrophe. Within weeks of the bankruptcy filing, Hooters began announcing restaurant closure, not the gradual, strategic pruning of underperforming locations that a healthy restructuring involved. Mass closure and simultaneous across multiple states. The problem was the franchise operators. Remember the two-track business model, corporate locations and franchise locations. When Hooters filed for bankruptcy, the corporate locations were directly affected by the restructuring, but the franchise operators were independent businesses. They didn't file for bankruptcy. They watched what was happening to the brand and made their own calculation, and the calculation many of them made was brutal in its logic. If the parent company is in bankruptcy, if the corporate locations are closing, if the brand is visibly contracting at scale, then the value of the franchise license I'm paying for is declining in real time. My customers are reading the headlines, my best staff are updating their resume, my landlord is watching the news. Franchise operators began exercising their own exit option, closing locations that were marginally profitable and had become clearly unviable once the brand's distress became public, surrendering franchise agreements rather than continuing to pay royalties to a company reorganizing in bankruptcy court. The corporate closures and the franchise surrenders compounded each other. Each announcement of additional closures made the remaining operators more nervous. Each franchise surrender reduced the system-wide sales figures that determined the brand's royalty revenue. Less royalty revenue meant less ability to fund the reorganization. Less reorganization funding meant more closures. This is what financial contagion looks like inside a franchise system. It's not linear, it's exponential. And once it reaches a certain velocity, there is almost nothing management can do to stop it. By the end of 2024, over 430 Hooters locations had closed. The chain that had operated over 420 locations at its late-stage peak, a chain that had survived 4 decades of cultural shifts, economic recessions, and competitive pressure, had been reduced to a fraction of its former footprint in less than 12 months. Let's be precise about where the blame actually sits, because this story has multiple villains, and none of them are the Hooters girl who showed up for a shift one day and found the doors locked. Villain 1, the private equity debt load. When you acquire a company using leveraged debt and service that debt from the company's operating cash flow, you're making a bet that the business will remain healthy enough to generate those cash flows indefinitely. No, Hooters was a mature brand in a competitive, evolving market. That bet was always aggressive. And for over a decade, the debt service requirement prevented the reinvestment that might have kept the brand competitive. Every competitor that modernized during the years, Hooters was frozen. That's the private equity debt at work. Villain 2, the COVID forbearance structure. The deferred lease obligations created a time bomb with a specific detonation date. The renegotiated lease terms and forbearance agreements signed in 2020 were always going to come due. The question was whether management would have the financial strength to address them when they did, or whether the underlying debt load, combined with declining sales, would make addressing them impossible. The answer became clear in 2023. Villain 3, the mass renegotiation strategy. This is the stupid decision. Not stupid because it was wrong in principle. Restructuring lease costs is correct strategy for a business with too much fixed cost. Stupid because of the execution, because attempting a mass, simultaneous restructuring in a way that made the crisis visible to every stakeholder simultaneously transformed a financial problem into a confidence crisis. A smarter approach, a location-by-location assessment, a quiet closure of the worst-performing sites, a selective negotiation with individual landlords might have achieved the same cost savings without triggering the franchise operator panic that caused the avalanche of closures. The mass approach announced the depth of the problem before the solution was in place. And in the restaurant business, when you announce the depth of your problem, the problem gets deeper. There's a cultural postscript to this story that deserves its own moment. Hooters' brand problem. The ambient discomfort of the objectification of its staff, the #MeToo era reckoning, the shifting consumer expectations around workplace environments was real. It was coming for the chain regardless of the financial decision. But it's important to understand what the cultural problem could have done to Hooters and what it actually did. On its own, the cultural headwind would have produced declining same-store sales, a gradual erosion of the customer base as demographics shifted, a need to evolve the concept more aggressively, more thoughtfully than Hoots, towards something that retained the casual casual dining and sports bar elements, while shedding the aspects of the brand that had become genuinely uncomfortable for a significant portion of the potential customer base. That evolution is hard. It's expensive. It risks alienating the existing base while failing to attract the new one. It's the kind of thing that requires capital, patience, and strategic clarity. Hooters had none of those things because the debt had consumed the capital, because the quarterly pressure of a leveraged balance sheet had consumed the patience, and because a management team focused on survival cannot simultaneously focus on transformation. The cultural problem alone might have produced a smaller, refocused Hooters. The financial problem on top of it produced a bankruptcy filing and 430 closed locations. Music. The two things were related, but the lever that turned a difficult situation into an unsurvivable one was the debt. Always the debt. Now let's talk about what comes next, because Hooters isn't completely finished yet. Following the bankruptcy filing, the reorganization process continued with the aim of finding a buyer or a restructuring path for the remaining locations. Reports emerged of potential acquisition interest. The brand still has name recognition. The remaining franchise operators still have customer base. The concept, stripped of its debt load, might be viable in a reduced footprint, focused on the markets where it still generates meaningful traffic and operated by franchisees with genuine local engagement. But here's the uncomfortable reality for any potential acquirer. The brand recognition that Hooters carries is double-edged. Everyone knows what Hooters is. That's the asset. But everyone also knows what happened to Hooters, the bankruptcy, the mass closures, the headlines about locked doors, and stranded employees. Rebuilding consumer trust after that scale of visible failure is one of the hardest things a consumer brand can attempt, and attempting it while simultaneously managing the cultural recalibration the brand still needs, while competing against Wingstop and Buffalo Wild Wings and every other sports bar concept that has been investing and modernizing for years. That is a genuinely daunting task. The franchisees who stayed, the ones who didn't surrender their agreements, are operating in markets where the brand still has enough residual loyalty to generate traffic. Those operators deserve a fighting chance. Whether the reorganization provides, one remains to be seen.